Anonymous sources. Reporters use them.
As one senior administration official told me,
U.S. military sources tell NBC News.
But news consumers don't always trust sources who refuse to be identified.
And you've elected to keep your identity a secret. Why?
Well, I think if they're going to give any information, I think they ought to give their name.
When I see something that's not identified, it makes me wonder why. It makes me wonder why. What are they hiding, or is it reliable?
If he's afraid to say his name, then you don't know if it's true.
I think the public does distrust the media more because of anonymous sources, and I think the media know this. That's why almost every major media organ says they want to ratchet down the use of anonymous sources. They know that kind of journalism doesn't play well with people.
I think the public feels that we are often unfair. And most of that feeling of unfairness is based on anonymous sources.
USA Today is a newspaper that has struggled with the issue of anonymous sources.
There was a point in USA Today's history where they tried to ban anonymous sources entirely. And it didn't work because there are times you absolutely need to have anonymous sources.
They wanted to compete more with the New York Times and the Washington Post for big headlines. And so they went back to using some anonymous sources. And then after using some, they used too many. And so we had embarrassing incidents like the Jack Kelly incident that gave USA Today a really black eye, and he had to be fired, the editor had to be fired. It's all because of anonymous sources.
The newspaper now has strict rules about anonymous sources. Reporters can use them, but they need to explain to editors why the information is important to the story and why that information can't be obtained on the record.
It's become too easy for America's news organizations to rely on anonymous sources. It's become too easy for people who have information to simply say, I'll tell you, but I won't let you say who I am. It's become part of our culture. And in my view, we've got to find a way to curb that.
You have to get people to talk under terms that are acceptable. I mean, you can't hit them, you can't force them to, you can't deceive them, but you can get them to talk.
The most famous anonymous source in journalism comes from Watergate, the scandal that brought down President Nixon. Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein had a source they called Deep Throat.
wow.
Deep Throat was this man, Mark Felt. Felt came into the open in 2005 after 30 years of anonymity. During Watergate, Felt was the #2 man at the FBI. Woodward and Bernstein wrote more than 400 stories, with Deep Throat helping to guide them to the truth. The reporting made Woodward and Bernstein famous in real life and the movies.
Deep Throat was right from beginning to end. I trusted the reporters because the reporters were right.
I'm not ruling out that there might be some cases where you need to protect anonymous sources. But on the other hand, I've seen too many cases where the media are using anonymous sources to produce stories that are very questionable and dubious.
We couldn't do our job if we didn't use anonymous sources. No investigative reporter worth his salt can get anywhere without talking to people on background and off the record.
Michael Isikoff is one of the top investigative reporters in the country. He was the first to learn about the investigation into President Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky. After September 11th, Isikoff won awards for his coverage about the treatment of prisoners in the War on Terror. In 2005, Isikoff wrote a short Periscope item in Newsweek about Gitmo, the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. An anonymous source told Isikoff about an upcoming Army report on prisoner abuse.
Almost in passing, when it talked about the abuses, it mentioned that guards had flushed a Koran down a toilet. Isikoff had this from a single source, a good source, but a single source.
This story made its way around the world and was linked to protests and deadly rioting in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Initially, obviously, we were concerned that we had written a story that was being cited as provocation for people dying. While we were thinking about that and trying to figure out what to do, we heard from the Pentagon that this bit about the Koran was not true, that they just flat out denied it. The Koran had never been flushed down the toilet.
The source was a bit apologetic. He could no longer be certain which was the document that he had read about the Koran flushing.
And as soon as I heard that, I knew we had to write a story that said, looks like we got this wrong. No news organization ever likes to retract a story, especially a controversial story that's caused some harm. So it was extremely painful. Yes, it was terrible around Newsweek. I mean, I wrote the story. It was a painful story to write.
In the end, the military did confirm 5 cases of Quran abuse at Guantanamo, but the flushing charge was never confirmed.
Give us some information so we can judge it. Way too often we just said a reliable source, said someone close to the White House. Somebody said to me the other day, that could be just somebody sitting in Lafayette Park, you know, some bum sitting in Lafayette Square is close to the White House.
Geneva Overholzer is a former ombudsman for the Washington Post. As in-house advocate for readers, she often wrote about anonymous sources and how they hurt the paper's credibility.
We speak differently when we're not held accountable. And I heard plenty of reporters doing that in the Post newsroom. Don't worry, you're off the record, feel comfortable, tell me anything you want to know. It's just easy. The second one, which is really quite foolish, is that sometimes I think, especially young reporters, sort of feel that maybe it makes the story a little more exotic. You know, I have an off-the-record source. I don't think that the public embraces this notion.
And if you really dig and you can get it confirmed or denied by a source that's willing to stand up and be identified, great. If you do not, then I think the chances that you'll have an unfair story are too big a risk to run, and I think a free press should be a fair press.
I'm sure the public is ticked off by anonymous sources because I'm ticked off by anonymous sources. When I read the Washington Post or the New York Times, it's frustrating not to know where's this information coming through. I play this sort of decoding game, and I'm a professional, I'm in the business, and I try to figure out, okay, well, where's this coming from? The public has to be frustrated by that. It's a Faustian bargain. It's a deal we make with the devil. It's not great, but it's the only way we can get information, and the public would be badly served if we didn't get that information.